and that will be after next. So our next one is a video, and it's Sonia and Professor Stoilova speaking about. Are we ready to tee it up?
A pleasure to have the opportunity today to present the findings from the LSE's contribution to the euCONSENT project. And we're going to talk, as you can see from our title, about the question of parental control tools and how they fulfil family expectations for child protection. My name is Sonia Livingstone, and I'm here with my colleague Mariya Stoilova from the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. In talking about parental control tools, I should say first that we are focusing on the experience of families in their kind of everyday life perspective. So while euCONSENT is primarily concerned with questions of age verification, age assurance and parental consent, from the point of view of families in their daily lives, what they see are a host of what they loosely call parental controls. And they're concerned as parents to find ways to use these that manage their children's online experiences. From a child's perspective, of course, there's a range of other considerations which are both domestic, concerning the family setting, but also concerns regarding child rights. And we are working within a child rights framework, drawing on the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, and particularly General Comment 25, which is the way in which the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has set out how the Convention, how child rights applies specifically to the digital environment, and it makes a whole series of provisions, as we'll note at the end, regarding the importance of treating children in a rights-respecting way within provision for their online safety and opportunities. So we begin, as I said, with a child rights perspective on everyday life, on what it means to grow up in the digital age, and we note the overwhelming effort by policymakers, businesses and parents and caregivers to protect children from the possible harms facilitated by digital technologies. And we've been noting in our work and in the wider society all the different kinds of child protection measures that are being designed to solve a set of kind of intersecting problems related to online risk. And those measures have a history. Many of them have been very protective and perhaps in key ways quite limiting of children's activities in digital contexts. And we see those protection tools changing. In fact, a number of the major platforms over recent months or more have been redeveloping and better designing their parental control tools. Within that, and in certain pieces of legislation, we note that both age verification and parental control tools tend to be seen as a kind of silver bullet solution to the challenges of child protection in a digital age. And we've been, in a way, the purpose of looking at the relation between children and parents in front of the screen and beyond the screen is to try to kind of see all the many other factors that really matter, both in making age verification and parental control tools more effective, but also recognizing that they can only be part of a wider solution, which includes a whole host of additional interventions, ranging from platform regulation through to education and awareness raising within the family. So within that kind of broader framework, this short presentation focuses on the question of parental control tools viewed from a child protection, child rights and family expectation perspective. I want to begin with, in terms of findings, with a little contextualization from the 2020 EU Kids Online report, which really addresses the question of evolving capacity, as a child rights framework would put it, and the so-called digital age of consent. I mean, ultimately, there isn't really a digital age of consent except in very specific contexts in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive and the GDPR. But families and in everyday life often talk about a digital consent as if it has much wider relevance. And even though we have some concerns about that, it proved a very interesting and meaningful question to ask parents in the EU Kids Online survey. And as you can see here, we asked very concretely to parents, what age do you think your child will be or was old enough to make their own decisions about what they do online? You can see from the graph that there are some country differences there, but what's really critical is the kind of the broad sense that children clearly around the age of 9 or 10 are not old enough to make these decisions. They need parental intervention and parental controls, and by the age of 16, 17, yeah, pretty much they are old enough. But within that is quite a grey area, and within that, of course, is where both the regulation and the parental awareness raising has its focus. So I offer this graph to show that parents are fully aware that somewhere between the age of 10 and 16, their children are in need of support, but also old enough to make their own decisions. And that's where we see a lot of the anxieties and conflict even within the family, between parents and children, and between society and parents regarding how those decisions should be made. A second slide from the 2020 EU Kids Online report gives a sense of parental attitudes towards the tools that are provided for them by industry and how adequate they are. I'm not going to go through all the findings in the interests of time, but just to note here that there is a desire for good parental controls. Most parents say these could help me feel more in control. I would feel my child is safer online, and yet lots of doubts. I don't know how they'd work. I don't know why it's necessary. It won't actually make difference in practice. It will take away my child's responsibility. It will harm my child's privacy, and so forth. So the desire is there from parents, the doubts are there from parents, and it's within that context that we reviewed the evidence on what actually the research shows about parental control tools.
So, Sonia, I will now speak about what we did by reviewing the evidence. We wanted to see what is already known about children's concerns, and also how children and families use these kind of technologies, how they negotiate parental controls, what is the response from children to parental mediation, how are age restrictions and filters used and sometimes bypassed. So we carried out a rapid evidence review with look at several databases for studies since 2010, because we wanted to see the most relevant and new research. And we found over 1,500 studies which met the criteria of the search words, which were a combination of technology words related to parental controls, to age verification, with child words as well. So we wanted to use this to formulate evidence-based and child rights respecting recommendations, but also to support the development of technological tool which incorporated children's and families' experiences into the technical solutions. So from the evidence, we found that nearly all of it is from US and Europe, so it's very sort of North-centric, and most of the evidence was on parental controls. There were fewer studies on age restrictions and age verifications. And the report is available at the address that you saw on the page. So we divided the studies into studies that offer some insight into the conditions or the context of using parental controls. So what are the factors that contribute to families and children using parental controls? So you can see here that we found 4 different types of suggestions or insights into that. One of the more kind of prominent categories was related to parenting styles and values, which inform the use of parental controls. So here we have things like parents who prefer rules tend to use parental controls more often. Also, those who worry about the children's screen time tend to use parental controls more often, or even those parents as well who want to have a more active involvement in how children use digital technologies. However, parents who are worried about children's privacy, who are worried that they'll be very invasive into what children do online, were the ones who tended to use parental controls less often. The other factor that contributed to parental control use was risk aversion and safety. There were 5 studies which looked at that. And the findings here suggest that the use of parental controls is related to a desire from parents to try to reduce children's exposure to online risk. There's a diversity of risks, and parents try to mitigate those by using those tools. And it depends whether they think that the child is likely to be exposed to these risks, whether it's vulnerable to those risks, and how prominent they think these risks are generally on the internet. So this relates to what Sonia was showing earlier, to the curve of child's different needs as they grow up. And also child development and needs is a different group of studies that we found that explained why families and children use parental controls. So in relation to that, we found that parents use them more often with younger children to try to supervise their use, and they tend to use them less with as children grow older. And some degree of monitoring and restriction seem to be acceptable for children when they're younger, but also, as Sonia was suggesting earlier, it varies from family to family, and also there's not a clear line where parents agree that children are now safe and they can be independent online and don't use these tools. So the last group of factors that explain parental control use relate to the skills of parents and their own technological use. So parents who are younger and are more digitally competent tend to be the ones who use parental controls more often. But interestingly, parents who are less tech savvy also use parental controls more often. And the explanation here is that they feel that they're not competent enough to guide their children to use the internet, and they want some additional resources to help them do that. So it's both the highly competent and the least competent parents who turn to parental control use and more often. But parents who find that the features of the parental control tools are not clear to them tend to use them less often, which makes sense as well. So we also looked at the outcomes from parental control use, and again here we identified 4 groups. So this is the big question that triggered our interest. Are these parental controls effective? Are they providing the protection that we expect? Because as Sonia was suggesting earlier, they tend to be seen as the silver bullet solution. So we wanted to see what the evidence suggests. Are they effective or not? And here we found that out of the 30 studies that looked at the effectiveness of parental control, looking at some of the outcomes, 17 studies suggested that there are beneficial or protective outcomes from using parental controls. So these things, most of the studies looked at the different types of online risks and how they were reduced. So here we have things like problematic gaming or age inappropriate gaming that was reduced as a result of using parental controls. Some other risks were illegal downloads, and screen time. They were also found to be reduced by the use of these digital tools. Privacy risks were also reduced by some of the studies suggest that. Exposure to some risky online content, such as unhealthy weight loss material, exposure to harm images or violent images, exposure to hate messages was also reduced, some studies suggest, by using parental controls, which is all excellent use. The access to misleading advertising was also another risk that was reduced. So while this is overall very good news, and we see some effectiveness of parental controls, once we start looking at the findings in a greater granularity, we see that the effects are somehow a bit more ambivalent than it seems, because some of the studies show that there are small or even very small effects of parental control use. Some of them show that there are partial effects. For example, in some of the cross-country studies, there's no effect in one country, but there's effects in another country. Also, some of the studies show that there's a range of mediating factors. For example, child-related characteristics like children's impulsivity has something to do with how the outcomes of parental control tools play out. Also, another shortcoming of the studies that show beneficial outcomes is that they often conflate the risks and harms, so they don't always evaluate harms. For example, screen time is not harmful to children. We know that some parents see it as a risk, but that's not necessarily the case, because children, when they spend time online, they take advantage of a lot of opportunities. So that's not necessarily a risk for children, even though some parents are concerned about that. And as we saw earlier, it's one of the main reasons why parents tend to use parental controls. And also, some of the studies that show beneficial protective effects measure parental controls alongside other child protection efforts. For example, there were some studies showing some school awareness efforts, or alongside other parental mediation efforts alongside. So they're measured not separately, but as part of as a larger parcel, which somehow conflates the findings. So in addition to that, we found that some of the studies, 8 studies in fact, show that there are some negative outcomes from parental control use. So there's a study suggested that when parental controls are used in the family, they might create conflict between parents and children. They might lead to erosion of trust, or they might reduce children's feelings of autonomy or privacy. The third group of studies that we identified is studies showing limiting outcomes. So this is where parental controls reduce the benefits of internet use, because they tend to reduce, for example, the time that children spend online. So that affects the amount of opportunities that they experience and the amount of benefits. So they can have a negative effects on things like getting access to educational content. They might have a long-term effect on impacting digital skills in a negative way. They might limit social interaction for children. And also, interestingly, a fairly large group of studies, so 12 out of the 30 studies, show that there's no change in the outcomes that were measured. So parental controls were either ineffective, or they were easy to bypass, or they were unable to provide the expected protection. So the overall number of studies is bigger than 30, because we've coded all the relevant aspects to each study. So one study could be coded several times. This also corresponds to some of the findings that our colleagues from Revealing Reality in their primary research with families in several European countries suggested. So as you can see from the quotations on the screen, children sometimes feel that parental controls are invasive. They feel that they take their privacy away. They feel that they take their agency away. Parents, on the other hand, feel that sometimes they have to negotiate the parental controls use, which creates conflicts. But other parents feel that they offer an easy solution, or something that is kind of more objective and gives them a way in to try to negotiate with children how they use the internet, and maybe limit some of the more risky engagement that children have. So I'll pass on back to Sonia to summarize some of the findings for you.
Thank you, Mariya. And just quickly to summarise then, as you can see from quite a sizable body of high quality evidence conducted in many countries, parental controls overall are shown to have mixed effects, with some studies showing that they help to reduce risk and offer better protection, but a fair number showing no effect or even adverse outcomes for children and young people. We've emphasised throughout this presentation that the use of technical measures cannot be seen as a standalone practice, but must be understood as how it's embedded in the diverse processes of parental mediation, digital access, and family life. Families are different and the findings are very diverse. So to function effectively, it seems to us that the research shows technical measures need to be age appropriate and to address the needs of both children and parents, I might say of families also, and they need to be explained to both. And it's on the basis of those conclusions and findings that we will end with our implications for children's rights and our evidence-based suggestions about what is needed for parental controls and all that goes with them in terms of age verification, parental consent, and so forth. So we begin by urging that measures used take account of children's rights and their best interests holistically, seeing the whole child and the whole circumstances of their living. Protective measures obviously should be effective, they should be proportionate and transparent. We see over and again that if the measures are too heavy or opaque and not comprehensible to families, especially to children, that there are adverse consequences. Children, as any child rights framework would urge, should be consulted regarding the processes of development and use of these measures, and parental controls should, as we say, be holistic. They should not only seek to protect children, but also respect children's rights to privacy, freedom of information, play, help services, autonomy, and minimise parental and commercial surveillance. The question of age is clearly critical in this area, and a rights framework thinks of it not in terms of simple age limits, but children's evolving capacity to make their own choices, and we think that these should be enabled, and the evidence suggests that more granularity of measures will better support children's changing needs. There is a concern in the literature that some measures might be discriminatory, assuming the presence of an engaged adult, for example, or measures that don't provide for children with disabilities would be another. Keeping an eye on questions of equity is crucial. And throughout, again, to enable that holistic approach, it seems to us that if measures do and could better enable children's agency and freedoms online, then we would overcome some of the overprotective effects and support children's rights more holistically. So we will stop there. Thank you so much for your attention, and all our research findings are on the euCONSENT website.